Oh, yeah, that's what I should be doing.
So this is the second flight of the Freewing F14.
Okay.
First flight, I was having some challenges where it was diving and rolling quite severely, and so made some tweaks to some of the control surfaces.
Eyes are watering.
The second flight here was mainly to confirm that it would fly straight and level. And so, for the most part, it flew pretty well. I actually got 3 laps in the pattern, and then you'll see here in just a little bit, I was doing a cross with the gear down, and then was going to turn on downwind to set up for a landing. And during that turning into the cross,
still diving a little bit, but
the plane just didn't seem to respond and went behind the trees, right? And so here in just a little bit we'll see that where it ended up and the way that it ended up where it's at, and then the damage, looking at the damage of the aircraft, was just unexplainable as to how this type of a crash and the damage could occur on the F14. And so we'll take a close look at some of the damage here, and then see if we can draw some conclusions. So we just passed 1 minute left on the timer, so we're going to set up for a landing. And here we lose
where are you
it.
going?
And you hear that I turn on the safe
I saw it
mode
behind trees. Did you
try
see
and
it?
level it out and recover the aircraft.
Oh man.
Okay, but it just ended up disappearing. So on to the crash site. At the end of that video, you saw that there was a strip mall there, and that's where last saw the F-14. Was very concerned about the F-14 going down into that parking lot and high probability of hitting a car. So drove around there, and actually on the back side of that strip mall in the parking lot, I ended up finding the F-14 here. So fortunately, as you can see here, the F-14 ended up behind the strip mall in the parking lot there, and the truck that's just to the right of it. This was a truck where this is a mobile car wash, and there was a guy washing a car back there, and the F-14 landed right in that spot. I talked to the gentleman there, and he said that it did not hit his truck or his trailer that's back there, and unfortunately it didn't hit him. So as you can see, it's the F-14 is pretty close to the truck and the car that he was washing, and since neither one of them got hit, obviously it did not fly through there and glide into the spot that it's at right now. Okay, you can see in the damage here that most of the damage, the F-14 is basically intact. Some of the parts, the canopy did pop off. Some of the plastic parts did come off. That you can see the gear. One of the gear is broken off, and I did have the landing gear down here. But for the most part, the fuselage is pretty much intact. The wings, the tail, everything was pretty much intact there. So next we'll look at the aircraft damage to see if we can't understand more fully what actually happened as part of this crash. So looking at the canopy and the front portion of the fuselage, other than damage caused by the nose gear folding up and hitting the bottom part of the front fuselage, there really wasn't a lot of damage. It snapped at where it was glued together, and other than that, there wasn't a lot of damage at all. The canopy itself popped off, no damage at all there. But anyone that's flown these jets, usually that front part of the fuselage, if it goes into the ground, that's the first thing that goes. But in this case, it was relatively unscathed, other than that front gear folding up and hitting the bottom of it. Next, we'll look at the fuselage and the landing gear. So on the bottom of the on the F14, you can see that the right gear is bent, but is still attached to the aircraft. The left gear was sheared off and was laying over maybe about 10 feet away. And you can also see here that on the left side of the fuselage, on the bottom side, there's a large split along that left side there. So that seems to indicate that left portion of the fuselage took the brunt force, in addition to the gear taking the force of the aircraft coming down. But if you look, there's not a whole lot of scrapes along the bottom of the fuselage, right? Typically, if it's going to scrape, it's going to take off the paint and some of the foam. But here you don't see a lot of that, right? The other thing here you can see is that the grate that holds the ESCs has popped up, and you can see those ESCs, the leads for the ESCs sticking up. Okay, and then also the little straits, or whatever they're called, the blue straits at the bottom. One of them was snapped off, and the other one was still pretty much attached, other than it was folded over. So next we'll look at the ailerons and the flaps. So this was the most interesting part, in that for the ailerons and the flaps, 3 out of the 4 control horns were separated from the aircraft. Okay, and you can see them hanging down here. On the left side, one of the control horns was basically just ripped off of the push rod. Okay, and there's actually a hole this was the flap. Yeah, you can see it here in the flap. There's a hole in the flap, and the control horn itself is gone. Okay, so what could cause? This is the only one that remained, and you can see it's depressed in there. But here, what could cause these to be ripped out of the out of the flaps and the ailerons with such force? Okay. Because it didn't hit any trees or anything like that when it came in. So here we'll look at the ESCs, the motors, and the center burner. So as I mentioned earlier, the ESC leads to the motors were ripped out, and the center burner that was attached to the motors, one of them came off completely. The other one, the LED lights, separated from the bracket that holds it onto the motor. So what could cause the ESC leads to be pulled away from the motor, and then also have enough force that the center burner is either removed from the motor, or the actual light is removed from the bracket itself? So now looking at the tail of the aircraft, basically it was pretty much unscathed. The elevators looked fine. The control horns looked good there. The rudder looked fine. There was no separation of any of the control surfaces there. It looked pretty good. So the last thing we'll look at is the tail hook, which is glued onto the aircraft. And when I picked up the aircraft, the tail hook had separated. You could see it there. I just propped it up there. But basically, it ripped away from the foam mount on the aircraft, and then where the end of the tail hook is glued onto the back end of the F-14, it came off of that. So what could cause enough force to rip that tail hook off of the F-14 like that? So how did the F-14 hit the ground at the crash? So there was no scrapes on the bottom of the fuselage, and the front part of the fuselage was intact, so obviously it didn't go in nose first. Okay, it must have come in basically vertical to the ground. Okay, and since there was no wing damage to either wing, and the sweep mechanism appears to be intact, you know, it must have been level when it hit, right? And so looking at the damage that we've seen, you know, we've got the front of the fuselage separated. We've got 3 of the 4 control horns that are ripped from the control surfaces. ESC leads were pulled out. Center burners were separated from the motors. It seems to indicate that it was, you know, basically the F-14 dropped basically out of the sky, and that drop was so severe on impact that those things could have happened. Okay. And it doesn't appear that there's any type of flat spin, because there's no indication of sideways or rotational scratches on the F-14. So what could have happened here to cause this type of a crash landing, right? Pilot error. You know, I made 3 successful laps in the pattern. You know, there was no issue with flying the aircraft. It seemed to be trimmed pretty well and was flying pretty well, so I didn't have any problems with that. So also, I would have no idea how you would get a jet like this to drop out of the sky and then to do it level. Okay, I just can't picture how one could do that. Okay. The other thing is, in this field, on the first flight, the first maiden, I had some issues on that area of the field. Fortunately, with the assistance of SAFE, I was able to recover the F-14 and to get it back on the ground safely. But in this case, it disappeared behind the trees, and then I didn't see you know, what happened after that until I went and drove around and found it in the back of the parking lot. But it does appear that, you know, that there's something that happens at this area of the field, and then, you know, the question would be, how do you get an aircraft to you know, a large jet like this to crash like the way that it did, right? It's very strange on how that could happen. So, you know, scratching the head, you know, the only explanation left is, you know, must be some secret Russian energy weapon that is able to bring down the aircraft. But even more bizarre is to get that aircraft to crash in the manner that it did.